I'm Bob from Hauptwerk Hardware, and today we're going to have a quick talk about pistons. Thumb pistons, toe pistons, they're both the same, just in different places. So I've had a question come in overnight, and it's in three parts really. The first part is, how do we wire these pistons up? Should they be wired up the same as stops, or should they be wired up like keyboards, or would they even be wired up like swell pedals perhaps? Well, we'll take a look at that in a moment, and I'll show you how they get connected to the encoder. The second part of the question is whether the pistons are or should be momentary or latching. On some organs you can press a thumb piston in and it stays pressed in until you press a different thumb piston, then the first one pops out, the second one stays in. On other organs you press a piston in and immediately it releases again as soon as you take your finger off the button. So which way round do they need to be? Well, the answer is they need to be the momentary type, where you press them and release them and they don't stay locked in. This seems a bit counterintuitive, I know, because when you press the piston in it sends a MIDI note on, or event on, and when you release it, it sends a MIDI off event. So it would sort of make sense that when you press it, something happens, and when you release it, whatever that something was immediately gets cancelled. So the third part of the question is, well, if they're momentary, how do their functions get latched in the software that you're actually using? So is that done in software, or is that done by some MIDI magic in the encoder? Well, the answer is it's done in software, and we'll take a look at Hauptwerk and we'll see how that works, and that's the first thing that we're going to do. I think we'll take the question in reverse order. So let's look at the functions in Hauptwerk first of all, and then we'll look at how you wire them up as a sort of second part to it. Okay, so here we are in Hauptwerk. This is the old version 4, what used to be the free version, with the St Anne's Moseley organ, which is the free organ that comes with it. So looking at the controls we've got on the screen, obviously we've got all our stops for the swell, the grate and the pedal, and then we've got some pistons, some thumb pistons along the front here, labelled 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So if you watch closely at how these work, if you press a piston, that sets the stops on the left, and when you release the mouse key, the piston pops back out again. So hold the key down, it's in. When we release it, it pops back out. So that matches with what we were talking about with a momentary function. That key doesn't stay latched in until we press a different key, it's released straight away. But the software has seen that key press and it's reacted by switching on these two stops. So now if we play the notes on the keyboard, we should get some sound that goes with it. I think it's fairly quiet the way that this is set up, but there should be some sound that comes out with that. Now, general cancel's the same, that's down here on the bottom right. If we press that in, as soon as we press it, the two stops on the left are switched off, and when we release it, it pops back out. And if we press number 5, we get a lot of stops pop out. We still don't seem to get any sound out of this thing for some reason, which is strange because it was working earlier. But anyway, yes, I do know why that is actually. It's just my speaker system has switched itself off on power saving, so that's fine. So from that registration on piston number 5, as you can see, that sounds however it sounds. If we press a different piston, that cancels number 5 and it inserts the registration, if you like, that's saved on piston number 3. And again, when we press general cancel, obviously that pops in, pops out, and everything is cancelled. And the same is true of couplers. So if we were to select the swell to grate, for example, and we set some stops on the swell, then we can play those sounds on both of the keyboards, but we've only pressed this piston in and it's come out again. Although the second time, you'll notice, if you watch the actual swell to grate control down here that's operating, it's kind of I think they call it a reversible piston. So you press it once to operate it, you press it again to cancel it. But the piston itself does not stay in one position. Now all we need to do then is to transfer the operation of these pistons from my mouse to the actual MIDI controls on the console. And the way we can do that is that if we right click the piston that we are interested in, we can do auto detect MIDI trigger, and it asks us to operate the MIDI switch, piston, button, key, or whatever that we want to use, and then to release it again. So it says turn the switch on, then off. So that's once only, press the piston and release the piston. And when we've done that, the Hauptwerk software will recognise that, and this little done box will light up. We then click on that, and that will then be assigned to this piston here. I can't actually do it at the moment because I don't have the console connected to the computer here, but you can see basically how it works. So that's the story with the thumb pistons and the couplers. A lot of people sending questions about couplers actually, because a lot of people think that we need to actually do something clever in the MIDI or in the encoder to actually make the couplers send to lots of MIDI and so on and so forth. Well, we don't need to do that because it's all taken care of for us within the Hauptwerk software, and that's true of all of the organs certainly the ones I've come across, all the virtual organs, sample sets, call them what you will, which you can get for Hauptwerk. And it's also the same for Grand Org and any of the other virtual organ softwares that you might want to use. So toe pistons are the same, they work exactly the same way. You press it and you release it, so it's on and then off again, but as you can see, it actually performs that operation just by pressing and releasing. Okay, so that's the same sort of thing. So that's how it works within Hauptwerk. Now let's go and take a look at how we can actually wire these pistons up and make them work with our encoder. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can wire these pistons up and get them working. This is a small console that's in for midification, you might say, and as you can see it's got a few little thumb pistons on here. So we've got 5 on the top manual, and we've got 7 on the bottom manual. The one on the left at the bottom is the setter, and the one on the right is general cancel. So what I'm going to do is I'll remove the top keyboard and piston rail, and we'll have a look and see how it's made, what we've got and what we can do with it. Okay, so I've removed the keyboard from the console now. So as we can see, we've got our 5 pistons there on the piston rail. So if I lift this up and we take a look underneath, you can see that we've got these wires coming from each one, and they just come along on this little bit, and they've been chopped off at the end there. So how do we connect these up? Well, if you look at it, basically what we've got here is the grey wire is looped through to each piston. Okay, so one side of each piston goes to that single grey wire, so that's what you're left with coming out of the loom. If we look at the other end of it here, so we've got 1 grey wire, and then we've got 5 yellow wires. Okay, so there's 1 yellow wire to each piston, and the 1 grey wire, which is common to all of them. And what happens is when you press the piston down, it just connects the yellow wire to the grey wire when you hold it in, and when you release it, obviously that connection's broken, and the same goes for all the other pistons. Okay, so how do we actually connect these things up? Well, rather than spend ages actually soldering them together and doing it in real life, I'm just going to show you from drawing it on here what we do. So it's different dependent on which encoder you're using, but we'll start with the universal encoder, and that's the one that the chap who sent the question in is using. So here are our 5 push buttons, which are our 5 thumb pistons, and as we said, we've got this grey wire which connects to one side of each piston. So that would be one side of each one connected together, and then this is our grey wire. Okay, So what do we do with the other side? Well, if we're using the universal encoder, we need to include diodes on every key. And just to mention it quickly before we go through all of this, for those that possibly already know, we wire these up the same as stops or keyboards. They're basically the same thing. So if you're using the universal encoder, each one of these will require a diode. So that would be connected to each piston like that. Okay, so these are diodes, and that's what they look like. I don't know how you can, whether you can see that, probably not. It's pretty small, but basically little glass bulb, if you like, tube with a black line at one end, and the black line is represented in the drawing by this line here. So does it matter which way round you have them? I mean, for example, you can have them this way, or equally you could have them that way round. All that matters is that they're all the same. Okay, so you can't have some that way and some that way because it won't work, but you can have them whichever way you like, and then when you actually program the universal encoder, you tell it whether the diodes face towards the common line. So in this case, this is the common line. Okay, and it's called that because it's common to all of the buttons. Okay, so when I say face towards, I mean this way. When I say facing away from the common line, I mean this way. Okay, if the common line's up here, it's facing away from it. So this is the front, if you like, of the diode symbol. So first things first, then we need to add our diodes. Let's get this one out of the way. And then all we would do is that we would bring these wires down to our note inputs on the encoder interface board. So if we've got our interface board here, it's got the 12 note inputs along the front there. So for those that don't know, the universal encoder requires all of your keys, stops, pistons and everything else to be arranged into musical octaves. Therefore there are 12 note inputs, if you will, for each octave, because there are 12 notes in an octave. So all we would then do is that we would connect these to each of the note inputs, and because they're only pistons, it doesn't really matter what notes they connect to. If you've only got 5 of them, then obviously these inputs here are just left disconnected as far as this is concerned. I mean, there would be lots of other wires coming off of these 12 note inputs going to all of your other manuals, stops and pedals, and that's why we need diodes on them, otherwise things will interfere with each other. But basically that's how you wire these pistons up. So if you've got 2 keyboards with 2 lots of pistons, it's up to you how you do it. You could do exactly the same thing again, coming off of the same note inputs, but we would connect our common line from the second lot of pistons to a different place. I'll cover that in a moment. Or we could connect our common line to the same place and just carry on and use more of these unused inputs. It depends how many pistons you've got. If you've got 25 or 30 pistons per piston rail per keyboard, then obviously you're going to be going through this 2 or 3 times, and you're going to have a whole bunch of common lines, because there's one common line for every 12 inputs is basically how the encoder works. But I won't go through that here because it's explained in the encoder videos and everything else. So our common line is going to come back to one of the common inputs on the encoder, which are different to our note inputs. So as I said, these are note inputs, okay, and these ones here are common inputs. And you choose, when you set the encoder up, again go away and look at the video on the universal encoder, it explains all about that, but you choose which common inputs. So let's say, and I can't remember how the board's laid out off the top of my head, but let's just say that this is number 10, and this is 11, and this is 12, and so on. So if we connect our common line, let's go for number 11. There we go. So we're going to connect our common line to number 11. This is common input number 11. So when we program the thing, we will set it up as a keyboard. Okay, and we will say that the common line, it's got one common line which is number 11, and then our note inputs will be connected to these, and we'll say that our lowest note is C, our lowest octave is whatever you want it to be. So basically all of those settings are just going to choose which MIDI events these things cause when you press them. So if you set the lowest octave to 0, for example, and you set the first note to C, then it will send note 1 when you press this. Or it might be note 0, I can never remember, it starts on 0 or 1 to be perfectly honest with you, but anyway, that's how it works. If you select lowest octave as number 2, this is going to start on 13, 3 it's going to start on 24, and so on and so forth, up through the octaves. So that's how it works with the universal encoder. If you're using the Tutty encoder, we've got the same thing again. So we've got our 5 pistons, like that, and these are all connected together via our grey common. And pretty much the only difference with the Tutty encoder is that things are grouped into groups of 8. Okay, so the universal encoder, they're grouped into octaves, into 12s, but with the Tutty encoder they're grouped into 8s. The reason it's done like that on the Tutty encoder is because there are an awful lot of keyboards out there that are wired up that way anyhow, and they're very easy just to figure out what their connections are and connect them to the Tutty encoder. So that's why it's done in 8s. So on the same common you could have up to 8 pistons maximum, whereas on the universal one you could have up to 12 maximum on the one common line, okay, because they would connect to these other inputs here. The easiest way to connect to the Tutty is to use the Tutty connection strips, which are nice long circuit boards, and along one edge they have got sets of solder pads that go all the way up, and they start at bottom C and they end on top C, and there are obviously 61 inputs because there are 61 keys, 5 octaves plus the top C, and these, as I said, are grouped into 8s. So what you've actually got is 2 pads for each key, and you can use those, you can connect them up that way. If you wanted to cut this line, okay, you could connect individually left and right side of one piston, left and right side of the second piston, left and right, and so on. But as long as you remember that 8 is the maximum, if you count up 8 notes, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, what you'll actually find inside the wiring of the circuit board is that this 8 are all connected together. So these give you the common for the first group of 8. So all you'd need to do is this common wire, you would bring it around and you would connect it to any of the first 8 on one side, and on the other side where they're labelled up as a note, so you'll see that on the board they're labelled C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and so on, all the way up, and you would connect these to those pins, just pretty much like that. So simples, that's all you got to do. As I say, you can do it in groups of 8. You don't need to put diodes on it if you're using the connection strips, because these contain all of the diodes that are required anyway. If you use a Tutty breakout board, which you can equally just as well do, and that's what I did, it's covered in one of the videos. It's the series on using tracker action keyboards, or MIDI-fine tracker action keyboards, and there's a bit in there, one of the videos, where I show how we use the Tutty breakout boards to connect to the thumb pistons on that particular keyboard. So I'll put a link to that video below, so you can go away and watch that if you want to. But basically the Tutty breakout boards have got 16 connections or solder pads, and they're arranged as a matrix. So the bottom, well, I can't remember which way around it is, but for argument it would depend which way around the board is, but one side is columns and the other side is rows. Okay, and there are no diodes on these boards, so if you wanted to connect to these, then your common line is going to come round and it's going to connect to the first column, and then you would want, on your rows, you would need diodes, and I'm drawing them too big and running out of space, but you get the idea. So this end of the diodes would connect to this point just the same as they did on the last diagram for the universal encoder. So basically the rear end of all these diodes would come along and connect to the rows inputs, and if you had 2 or 3 keyboards, or if you had 4 or 5 sets of 8 on any one keyboard, you basically use these pins over and over and over. So the first 8, these pins connect to let's just put them on here so that we can see. So these diodes connect to these pistons, and then if we had a second lot of 8 pistons, so let's just draw a couple in here. Okay, you can reuse these pins again, so these would come out to, via diodes of course, to these pistons as well, and then this common side would come back to the second column, and so that would go on. So you can have up to 8 there, you can have up to 8 here. This all gets a bit confusing just trying it off the cuff like that. Go away, watch the video, I'll link it below about how we do it, but by far the easiest way, if you're using a Midi encoder, use the connection strips, and then you can just connect them like these. You don't need to worry about diodes, as I say, they're all built into those strips. For the breakout boards they're not, so if you're a bit more competent and confident with electronics, and you want to save some money, these are the way to go, because obviously they're a lot cheaper than the connection strips because they don't have diodes on them, and they're quicker and easier to make. So that's basically how it would work for connecting things up. So I hope you found that helpful, and if you did, if you'd be kind enough to click the like button and the subscribe button, that would really help me out, because it lets YouTube know that people are enjoying my videos and looking forward to more. So until next time, thanks very much for watching.